Okay, good afternoon and welcome everybody to the ISCIA Seminar series, What Were We Thinking? And today we are joined by Alex Pennington. So I'm super stoked, Alex, to hear what it is you've had to say. I'm particularly excited about this talk because it speaks to something that's very close to my heart. I think if I'm correct in what the talk is about, which relates to this idea of practicing courage and what that means to practice courage. So Alex is a practicing counsellor, an experienced practicing counsellor in Cape Town, and has studied and apprenticed in the philosophy, science, and art of mental health for over a decade, and has also studied through two world-class universities. I think our overachiever has two separate master's degrees in relation to this as well. So Alex's talk today in this session speaks to what he describes as the profound disenchantment and disconnection that is found in much of the Anglophone world, and also, speaks to what it is that this seminar series is concerned with. So in this talk, Alex is going to talk us, I believe, through the lens of the ethical philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. He's going to speak to us about what it means to practice courage. So without further ado, Alex, take us away and off you go. You are muted, Alex, just so you know.
Yes, sorry about that. I'm just setting up the slideshow. Thank you for such a generous introduction. It's something I really appreciate about this seminar series. Okay, I'm on presenter view, so I'm a bit of I'm not
That's
so
perfect.
well practiced. Okay, so can everyone, well, I hope everyone can see.
Yep, all good.
So just to say hello to everyone who's here, and just to say thanks to Andrea for this wonderful seminar series, and Emma, our lovely co-host, and Gary, and for inviting me to listen and just now to speak. I have to thank all the previous presenters for their food for thought, and I have many sources of inspiration who I'm also very grateful for, like my friends in poetry, my Canon's writing group, my dinner story friends, and the Substack of George Sanders. In the last few years, I've been working particularly closely with the philosophy of Alfonso Lingus and his ready companion, Andrew Feldmar. But the person who I am especially grateful for and I want to dedicate this presentation to is Helen Douglas. So, without further ado. Some of you may, through the presentation, look at me like Derrida's looking at us now, just because some of the things here need a bit more time in the oven, but I thought this would be a perfect place to bring the presentation to for some heat or for some warmth. So part of this presentation is an attempt to think through or imagine what ethics might look like if it's not the kind of ethics we're taught today. And I'm partly doing this because if the tradition of practice that is widely taught at universities doesn't help us become a more ethical person, then that needs to change. And what will this change into? Which is the question I think we've been summoned to try and answer in the seminar series. And my hope is that it can become a tradition of practice that helps us to practice courage. So this was the painting on my textbook in my first year philosophy course. It's by Caspar Friedrich called Wanderer in the Sea of Fog, which I think depicts an ideal of the philosopher as the person who, through the power of their thoughts, stands above fog. But in Dancing with Roger's presentation, he wonderfully illustrated how we don't only think with our heads, but we also think with our whole bodies. And if our bodies are extended into space, how we think depends a lot on the place we're in and the company we keep. And I can speak quite certainly that the way that I'm able to think and what I'm able to imagine changes dramatically if I'm in the company of people who make me feel frightened or have made me feel ashamed, compared to someone who I feel loved by and cared for. And in the company of those kinds of folks, we can be vulnerable, we can freely express ourselves, we can trust, we can mourn, then we can transform. It becomes possible to talk about everything and the whole world opens up. And this makes me think that another ideal of the philosopher is someone who is very good company, like an extremely good therapist or a very dear friend, but this is not the kind of ideal that's depicted. This painting is another instance, but on my cover of my applied philosophy textbook was an image like this. If you look at my screen, this is, I still have my, it's a bit blurry. But it's sort of this picture, which is a lone figure facing a natural landscape. A lot of other philosophy textbooks do away with the person entirely. It's just the landscape. And this is what sort of Charles Taylor does with his, and not that I'm saying he's misanthropic, but sorry, I just missed something. So what I'm also struck by in philosophy books, and especially textbooks, is that they are filled with arguments. And so the form of writing as an argument is designed to appeal to our reason. And I'm not convinced that this is the only way that we can help steer someone or ourselves towards the good. And so I began to think about what does philosophy look like when it appeals to our senses? And I think if you pursue that question far enough, then you sort of land in the area of literature and poetry. And this is exactly where Charles Taylor goes with his book, Cosmic Connection. And he has this wonderful definition of connection as a mode of awareness of the surrounding world, shot through with joy, significance, inspiration, and give me some of that. That's the good stuff. And this is a very much an affirmation of art, and the way we take pleasure in this connection is through art. But throughout the text and in his other work, he has this suspicion towards science because it somehow plays a role in disenchanting us from the world. But if you hang out with enough scientists, then you get a sense that they're some of the most awe-inspired people that you can come across, and they're deeply enchanted with the world. And so I think Taylor misses something here, and I think he misses something on the grounds of his own philosophy, because he often talks about the porous self, how we take in things around us. But if we take things around us, then I think there's something else that Taylor hasn't really discussed, and I think that's the kind of thing we talk about in ethics. You know, the ways that we treat each other, what we receive from others, and how this shapes who we are. And so another way to think about connection is something that I draw from Wittgenstein, who in his lecture on ethics says that seeing something as a miracle is seeing it in wonder, which is a sentence that you could chew on for a decade. But this helps me understand something that Levinas said, which is a sort of working definition of ethics that he notes in Totality and Infinity, which is that ethics is a spiritual optics. I've been thinking about that for years. I don't really know what he means, but if I think what he means is that, or at least how he can be read, is that ethics is not about having the right theories. It's not about having the right rules. But perhaps it involves asking, well, if wonder opens the window to miracles, then what opens the window to truth? And he puts an emphasis on sincerity. But part of the reason why I like this photo is that it's very difficult to tell from this photo what the depth of the friendship between Maurice Blanchot and Emmanuel Levinas is, which is something I'll come back to later. So on the matter of truth, Foucault also thinks a lot about the truth, and he said something so fascinating in the hermeneutics of the subject, which I'd never come across before, because he's often so criticized, and then, you know, if Foucault's so criticized, then maybe you shouldn't read him. But he says something about how our notion of the truth has changed, and it's partly changed because there used to be an entanglement of these two questions, which was philosophy's question: how does someone have access to the truth? And then there was another question, which is the question of ethics. which is what are the transformations which are necessary for the person to access the truth? A very interesting thing. And when these questions are coupled together, it becomes possible to think about the truth in terms of an epiphany, a kind of reward for a price that gets paid to become a person capable of sensing the truth. If the question of ethics gets ignored, and I quote from Foucault, it is assumed that what gives access to the truth is knowledge and knowledge alone, which is why I think philosophy spends so much time on epistemology and not on ethics. And it basically means that we have the facts, then we have the truth. And these facts must be cleansed of any form of bias. They must be as clean as a whistle, which can then be used to blow the moment someone starts to speak about their experience. So what is exactly at stake when the question on the truth no longer has an ethical question attached to it? And I think George Sanders put some good words to this. So he says, the world is full of people with agendas, trying to persuade us on their behalf, spend on their behalf, fight and die on their behalf, oppress others on their behalf. But inside us is what Hemingway called a built-in shock-proof shit detector. How do we know something is shit? We watch the way the deep, honest part of our mind reacts to it. And that part of the mind is the one that reading and writing refine into sharpness. So, I mean, sure, there's reading and writing, but there's also listening. And so when I think about George's insight in the context of the work that I do, you know, I think about also when I arrived at therapy and that my own shit detector, it needed an upgrade, or another way to think about it is that it malfunctioned, or that it was so beaten out of shape that it didn't work very well. And then, you know, these are the kinds of people who come to see me too. And I think part of the reason, there are many reasons, but a reason why detectors are so out of shape is because something terrible has happened to someone, and people have often responded with indifference, or they've tried to put a positive spin on it. So someone will say in the face of someone else's loss, well, we're only given as much as we can handle. Or our sorrows provide us with lessons we need to learn. Or the classic, there's a reason for it. And these are all different ways that people pound grief into the ground. And then sort of what happens is someone's own grief becomes ambiguous and they don't really know what to feel or how to feel, what to call it, and sort of lose trust in their own feelings, the detectors. And then it becomes very hard to tell the truth. And so if George is saying that the honest part of our mind can be sharpened, it also means that the honest part of our mind can be dulled or numbed. Or someone can become so insensitive to that part of themselves that it becomes difficult to tell who's being sincere and who's not. And sometimes it becomes so difficult to know what the truth is that we lose our way. And or sometimes that someone is too fearful to accept what we might call the truth, that we don't wake up to the reality of our lives and try to change. And change is very difficult. It's so difficult that Alden, the poet, says, we would rather be ruined than change. And so part of this presentation is to look at how does this ruin show up? What does it look like? How can we be sensitive to it? And so for the next while, I'm going to talk about pride. And so what I really like about this picture is that it's someone looking at themselves. And I often find people who are extremely prideful, like the person I'm about to talk about, stops listening to others. And so Nigel Bigot, the person who I've quoted, is a fairly well-known apologist of the British Empire. And while in conversation with John Anderson, who was the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, says, if you believe in the stories told about our colonial past, that it was nothing but a litany of racism, oppression, and violence, that has to shake your confidence in the states and institutions that we built, because our states were involved in this imperial oppression and wickedness. So it's really important that the whole truth is told. So there's a lot at stake in the truth. But if truth is synonymous with knowledge, then Professor Bigger can write a book on the legacy of the British Empire, and as he does, generously condenses the whole truth in a novel and accessible way, which is a debit and credit list. So, the classic, oh, well, here are all the bad things that happened, here are all the good things that happened, and the balance checks out that on the whole, the British Empire was a force of good. And as he assures us, these facts speak for themselves. So I want to criticize this, but I'm going to criticize it in a roundabout way through looking at another context or another history, which is the history of the prison. And so while I was writing about this, I couldn't, I didn't remember that Foucault had written a very famous book about prisons. And I like this image because this is how I look like when I listen to Nigel Igger speak. And I think this is something that Charles Taylor misses about disenchantment, and that sort of Foucault is picking up on. How had it become a widespread idea? So widespread that it is found in child-rearing practices, schools, both religious and secular institutions to this day, largely in the Anglophone world, but not exclusively, those who comprise of Taylor's audience, that punishment edifies a person. Where does this idea come from? Well, we can turn to a brief history of the prisons. And I think there's this wonderful quote by Jocelyn Pollock that of all forms of punishment, prisons are the most complex. So this picture is a picture of a workhouse. It's pretty grim because prisons are a very recent institution. We're not, compared to the church, for instance. And so the British state had a whole bunch of things called bridewells and workhouses, ghouls, or jails that people would stay in, the houses of correction. And for the most part, people who were there were not actually violent people. They were runaway apprentices, they were unmarried mothers, they were those who begged for food, they were merchants who didn't have a license to sell things, there were people who didn't seem to be doing anything particularly useful, people who slept on the street or were unable to earn an income, those who swore and got drunk, and lied to get more relief from the meager services at the time designed to care for the poor or slaves. So in other words, those who hadn't committed an act of violence were often thrown in these houses of corrections and then tortured by the correctional officers. Or they were banished to the colonies to make livings for themselves as indentured laborers. In a word, they were punished. And as Jeremy Bentham writes, a very famous English philosopher in his day in the 1800s, in his book, Rational Punishment, says, and I quote, "The individual was punished with bondage rather than for the crime he had committed." And sort of then there's this history. There's this change in the 18th century around prisons, well, not prisons, about institutions for reform for these kinds of folks. And so then you have the construction of something called the Eastern State Penitentiary in 1822. And just sort of, for those who don't know, penitentiary is derived from the word penitence, whose Latin root directly translates to repentance or sorrow for having committed sin. And so the logic goes that since torture, which was widespread before the invention of the prison, so beheading, putting someone in the stocks, dismembering people, the guillotine, that this was really inhumane, and now we need to move something more humane. What could be more humane than rehabilitating someone? And the way that we do this is by forcing someone to self-reflect. And if they are self-reflective, then they're able to come to terms with who they are. They're able to contemplate their sins, and in the expression of sorrow, that would purify their souls so they can go back out into the world. So this is what the Eastern State Penitentiary looked like. It had a radial design, which was drawn from psychiatric hospitals. This is what it looks like from a bird's eye view. And so unlike the rival system at the time in prisons, like the rival system in New York, which was otherwise communal, except people were kept in their cells at night. The penitentiary was the first large-scale construction to accommodate what was called the Pennsylvania system, which is a system of solitary confinement, where a single prisoner would be kept in their cell all day and night. And this was something of a moment. And it was notable that this design was based off of Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon, which is something that Foucault picks up, because Bentham had this idea that prisoners would then internalize the gaze of authority, which would act as a deterrence for crimes they might commit in the future. So someone quite famous visited the Eastern State Penitentiary and saw the effects of the system of solitary confinement on the prisons themselves, and that person was Charles Dickens, who wrote a chapter in one of his books about this, and he goes on to say, looking at as sort of his review of the Eastern State Penitentiary, in its intention, I am well convinced that it is kind, humane, and meant for reformation, but I am persuaded by those who devise the system of prison discipline, and those benevolent gentlemen who carry it into execution do not know what it is that they are doing. I believe that very few men are capable of estimating the immense amount of torture and agony which this dreadful punishment prolonged for years. He goes on to say, I hold the slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body, and because its ghastly signs and tokens are not so palpable to the eye and sense of touch as scars upon the flesh, because its wounds are not upon the surface, and it extorts few cries that human eyes can hear, therefore, the more I denounce it. So Charles Dickens was, his critique is an early echo of the modern research in solitary confinement. And the modern research basically shows that it is the most surefire way to drive someone into complete madness, which means they're unable to think. But what's really curious about the administrators of the Eastern Penitentiary, and this is revealed by an absolutely fantastic book by Ashley Rubin called The Deviant Prison, that the criticism of Dickens was taken very personally by the administrators. And so the phrase he uses, benevolent gentlemen, was a common self-reference of the officials who ran the prison, coincidentally all happened to be men. But Rubin identifies how the pride of the officials got in the way of admitting that what was happening under their watch, which is in no uncertain terms a state-sponsored form of torture, and meant that these efforts of the officials stopped the Pennsylvania system from being changed. So it becomes very interesting as the positions themselves take on a certain kind of status symbol. Because, and this is what psychoanalysts identify as splitting, the bigger the front, the bigger the back. And she picks up an excellent example of how deluded the officials become. So this was from a state penitentiary, a report, and she quotes, of the prisoners. They are taken to the bath and cleansed of outward pollution. They are new clad in warm and comfortable garments. They are placed in an apartment infinitely superior to what they've been accustomed. They are given employment to enable them to live by their own industry. They are addressed in the language of kindness. Interest is shown in the present and future welfare. They are advised and urged to think of their former curse and to avoid it. They are lifted gently from their state of humiliation. Self-degradation is removed and self-esteem inducted. Pride of character and manliness is inculcated, and they go out of the prison unknown as convicts, determined to wrestle for a living in the path of honesty and virtue. Is not this humane? So, I mean, there were also reports given by the same officials of how people were driven so mad by the system of solitary confinement there that some would jump from the fairly high areas of the building as soon as they got out and commit suicide. Some would bash their heads against the bars to the point of mangling themselves or self-mutilating themselves. So this is a really astonishing instance of delusion because of how adamant they were in the annual reports. So at the core of this philosophy of prisons, as punishment as a means to moral behavior, that cruelty leads to moral improvement, that the use of violence will not create more violence. for me, is a question of where does this idea come from? What kind of society holds that such unsettling violence serves as an edifying function? And so for this, I turn to an excellent book by Caroline Elkins. As Victorian-era parents disciplined their progeny, recalcitrant childlike natives in the empire had to be punished. In a perversion of Proverbs, whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to disciplining him. Colonial officials and security forces wanted their infantilized subjects to see and feel their own suffering. They wanted them to know it was deliberate and purposeful. Britain had a term for this, the moral effect of violence. So part of the propaganda of, I mean, as we all know, of the British Empire was to say this was a civilizing mission. We're bringing out peoples who inhabit these lands out of a state of savagery into civilization. But there's an often unspoken intensity of violence that comes with that history. And for a source of that, we don't need to look anywhere beyond the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who speaks with great pride about the legacy of the British Empire. And it's, yeah, I suppose in the context of looking at the pride of how prison officials, this is a particularly unsettling quote when he says, "I cannot help remembering that this country over the last 200 years has directed the invasion or conquest of 178 countries. That is most members of the UN." Going on about romanticizing the empire, and I think what he says here relates to my own life very personally, which I'll get onto in a minute. Stammering with pride when he says Churchill was right when he said the empires of the future will be empires of the mind, and expressing our values, I believe that global Britain is a soft power, superpower, and it can be immensely proud of what we are achieving. So what does this pride leave out? And so now I'm going to talk about someone called Sir Arnold Wilson, who's my great-grandfather. To gesture to a period of violence that was largely undisclosed in my own family. So the story of Arnold goes that he was the first Minister of Parliament to fight in World War II when it broke out. But he was too old to fight in the army, and so he had to pull strings to get around the age barrier to fight against the Nazis as part of the Air Force, and then he died in combat. So the story told with more conviction than I'm telling it now casts Arnold as a hero, a tragic one because he died in conflict, having sacrificed his life. But there was so much of the story that was left out that I couldn't appreciate as a child because I was a child. And then I started to do some digging. And I had to join a lot of dots to do this. But the information is there. It just wasn't something that was told as part of our family history. And this says something quite profound for me about what Johnson is mentioning as a form of soft power. So Sir Arnold Wilson became a civil commissioner. This is just to tell the story of who he was before he started fighting the war. He was the civil commissioner of Mesopotamia in 1918. He was given the nickname the Despot of Mespot. Mesopotamia being currently called Iraq, and it was called Mespot as an insult by the British because most of the peoples who lived there were organized in nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes. So it was a messy place, hence the name Mespot. Arnold Wilson also worked before this for an oil company, which becomes an important part of the story later. But he understood the strategic relevance of having a large oil supply, and I think this is in part why Iraq was such an important strategic location. In the words of T. Lawrence, the Lawrence of Arabia, who stated the British propaganda at the time as for why the British were there. I quote, "We said that we went to Mesopotamia to defeat Turkey. We said we stayed to deliver the Arabs from the oppression of the Turkish government and, of course, to make available for the world its resources of corn and oil." And by the world, Lawrence obviously means the League of Nations. But sort of classic civilizing mission. We're going in there to help people, and sort of we're doing this for the sake of the good. But once it became clear that the British did not seek to liberate but occupy, mass gatherings and peaceful protests ensued against the proposed British rule. Because the majority of peoples in the area were part of tribes, 15 representatives were chosen to make the case for Iraqi independence. But it was dismissed by Wilson, and that led to an uprising. And in the face of the uprising, the British could have withdrawn their troops because these were people who were not a threat to Britain. They were people who had not invaded British land, who had committed no harm to the British public. Instead, and under the leadership of Wilson, the British employed the Royal Air Force and slaughtered thousands of people. Lawrence of Arabia, who reported on what happened, said the killing was a disgrace to our imperial record, a quote. Now, given that Lawrence is a believer in the good of the empire, for someone like him to say that this was a disgrace for an already overwhelmingly violent imperial record suggests how shocking it was. His report of the toll that the uprising took also suggests quite a profound crisis of conscience, although for someone who is worried about how these deaths will mar resource production instead of the possibility of life and love. And he says, I quote, "We say we are in Mesopotamia to develop it for the benefit of the world. But how far will the killing of 10,000 villages and townspeople this summer hinder the production of wheat, cotton, and oil? How long will we permit millions of pounds, thousands of imperial troops, and tens of thousands of Arabs to be sacrificed on behalf of the colonial administration, which can benefit nobody but its administrators?" And so in part of this report of the revolts, he's also calling attention to the British public to become aware of what happened because it was being downplayed by the administration. And so he says, and I quote, "The people of England have been led in Mesopotamia into a trap from which it will be hard to escape with dignity and honor. They have been tricked into it by a steady withholding of information. The Baghdad communiques are belated, insincere, incomplete. Things have been far worse than we have been told. Our administration more bloody and inefficient than the public knows." So there are a couple of quotes that I won't go through just for lack of time on members of the Royal Air Force and how they sort of took delight in bombing villages as a way to sort of stranglehold the population into starvation. But after that revolt, my great-grandfather was given the highest honor that can be accorded by the British government for a citizen, which was a knighthood. He was removed from his position. He went back to work for an oil company. In his spare time, he played an active role in the British Eugenics Society, which in 1930 formed a committee whose overriding concern was to sterilize those who were deemed feeble-minded as a method of population control, whose membership peaked in the 1930s after Adolf Hitler was elected into power. Responding to Hitler's rise, many years after Mein Kampf had been published, Sir Arnold Wilson expressed that Hitler was, and I quote, "profoundly conservative in that he desires to conserve what is best." Levinas. The bloody barbarism of National Socialism lies not in some contingent anomaly within human reasoning, nor in some ideological misunderstanding, but from the possibility of elemental evil into which we can be led by logic and against which Western philosophy has not sufficiently insured itself. part of the reason why Levinas's philosophy is so significant for me is that he helps me to understand what the difference is between shame and remorse, lust and love, emotions as states held in the body, or emotions as tunes that sound in the voice. And it helps me to understand how becoming a more ethical person is to be sensitive. So it's quite a brave piece written by someone called Samantha Weiss, How Do I Live in This Strange Place, which sort of deals with how do we confront the legacy of people in the world like my great-grandfather or the legacy of the British Empire. And this is obviously relevant for South Africans living in post-apartheid era. And she believes that the way in which we come to change our lives, drawing on a Christian word called metanoia, is shame. And I think there's a caution to be had there. I think it's a very useful and insightful piece. But if I read that alongside another article written by a psychoanalyst, David Shapiro, is describing accounts of people who have been abused and tortured, and how it is those who feel shame, not the people who were the torturers. The torturers often feel pride. And part of the reason how he makes sense of this is to look into the kinds of ways that people are treated who then aren't going to become soldiers, and part of the training that they receive. And he describes the aim of such training is to punish and instill contempt for, even hatred of, weakness or softness, to teach unflinching hardness, and to bring about not surrender to brutal coercive authority, but respect for it and identification with it. Those who completed this training regard themselves as an elite group, feeling anything but weak and helpless themselves, secure in the identification with an authority of established power and a position to demonstrate and experience their own personal strength. What have they to be ashamed of? So the classic difference between something like shame and guilt is that shame is directed towards the self, who one is, whereas guilt has to do with something that one has done. So obviously in real life, the distinction isn't particularly sharp. We do call particular actions shameful, but the shame attached to those actions generally reflects their significance for who one is. A shameful act, to quote Shapiro, shows the one who performs it to be cowardly, weak, and selfish. So in trying to embark upon a restorative journey, I think it's impossible not to experience shame, but we can recognize a distinction between shaming and facing shame. When a person faces shame, they come to their own realizations by recognizing what they have done. By contrast, shaming others is a political act, an attempt to coerce control. And I noticed this, I was struck by a debate that I was watching held at Oxford University, just to elaborate sort of the relationship about shame. And, you know, the word debate is a particularly interesting word because it means to beat down completely. And it resonates with the word debase. But there was an Anglican priest who was defending the position that the church should not bless same-sex marriages. And sort of as he was going through his argument, he said, well, if we throw out heterosexuality, why not throw out monogamy in the case of marriage? If love is love, as we are told, then surely 3 men loving each other is more love than 2 men loving each other. And someone in the audience shouts, woo, as sort of an affirmation, but and the rest of the audience laugh, but this particular priest doesn't. And then he shouts at the audience in his gravest voice, shame, degeneracy. Obviously, that word being a particularly loaded one in the context of eugenics. But it also struck me that in my own practice, I've never told someone that they should be ashamed of themselves. And I think in part there's something there about the difference between shame and remorse, being that in shame, one prioritizes the self, and in remorse, one prioritizes the other. And I think this is why one of the reasons why Emmanuel Levinas's philosophy is so important. But I see shame also as a continuation of this long history of punishment. And in confronting this long history is another fantastic book called The Dawn of Everything. And in the conclusion of this book, they have this wonderful insight about how it is so difficult to imagine living in a society which is not merely moving from one smaller cage to a larger one, because they pick out this connection in this history of the way that so many people are raised to become more ethical by being shamed. And so, to quote, it seems to us that this connection, or perhaps confusion, between care and domination is utterly critical to the larger question of how we lost the ability to freely create ourselves by recreating our relationships with one another. And so in thinking about this, I think of how the story of courage that is told about my great-grandfather is a story that is sort of told in the context that emphasizes these very hard militaristic virtues. And so then I tend to sort of think, well, where the place of these softer virtues? Can we describe, or can we tell a story about heroes who have, or who embody this other virtue of courage that can meet the suffering of the other, that experiences remorse, is able to be changed by that experience of remorse as we are changed by the experience of grief? And fortunately, there are people like this. I'm deeply inspired by the words of Joseph Ratzinger that I'll mention very briefly later. One of my favorite monks, Pema Chodron, I don't know really how to say her name, and there are, of course, poets as well, someone like June Jordan, who has this beautiful passage in her work, which is an emphasis and an affirmation of tenderness. And obviously, when I think about her, I think of someone else who's very important to me, who I think sort of rounds up a lot of the talk that I've just given. And I'm going to quote her directly on this one, from a wonderful piece that she wrote, which is asking this question: when we let go of the desire to shame, when we let go of the desire to punish, of being aggressive, what do we then call forth as softer virtues? And so to quote, "As a philosophical thinker and as a woman, I am intrigued to notice that this practice runs on qualities that are not celebrated in Western philosophy: passivity, willingness, care, humbleness, discretion, feminine qualities, which is to say, qualities that the fathers of philosophy assigned to women, qualities scorned and dismissed as slave morality. But when people come to this more hostile, when they are beside themselves with hurt and fear and confusion, it is these soft virtues that allow me to become present usefully and without harm. What would it mean to give these elements a central role in philosophy?" I'm just going to go back a little bit, because shame has a long history in Christianity. But I think part of sort of resistance to that does come from the words of Joseph Ratzinger in a very beautiful encyclical, which is a sort of series of letters to the Catholic Church. And he writes a piece, Deus Caritas Est, which is, in his words, to try and describe the heart of the Christian faith, which has to do with the idea that God is love. and who abides in love, abides in God. So obviously the word love has an astonishing semantic range. And so in this piece, Ratzinger goes on to clarify what sense of the word he's trying to describe. And what he uses as a point of reference is a work in the Old Testament called Song of Songs, and notes that the poems contained in this book are possibly love songs, possibly intended for a Jewish wedding feast and meant to exalt conjugal love. To quote him, in this context, it is highly instructive to note that in the course of the book, two different Hebrew words are used to indicate love. First, there is the word dodim, a plural form suggesting a love that is still insecure, indeterminate, and searching. This comes to be replaced by the word abba, which the Greek version of the Old Testament translates with the similar sounding agape, which becomes the typical expression of the biblical notion of love. And so in contrast with this indeterminate searching love, agape expresses the experience of a love which involves a real discovery of the other. And rather than seeking the good of the self, it seeks the good of the beloved. And I quote, love in this transformation now becomes concern and care for the other. And then Ratzinger goes on to say something which I think is so profound, because unlike the previous Anglican priest that I mentioned, who's part of a very conservative movement that says the church is steering away from, it's moving into apostasy because it is no longer relying on the authority of Scripture. Ratzinger goes on in his writing to affirm that the Christian path doesn't rely on such authority. And so I quote, if I have no contact whatsoever with God in my life, then I cannot see in the other anything more than the other, and I'm incapable of seeing him or her, in him or her, the image of God. But if in my life I fail completely to heed others, solely out of a desire to be devout and to perform my religious duties, then my relationship with God will also grow arid. It becomes merely proper, but loveless. Only my readiness to encounter my neighbor and to show him love makes me sensitive to God as well. And so this is what I see sort of in running through the final people that I've shown, that becoming an ethical person is not a matter of knowing what the right rules are or knowing what the right theory is, but becoming much more sensitive. And I think Helen's work is a very profound affirmation of what that means. So part of this presentation has been an attempt to put things in the right order. It's not really an attempt to give answers. And so I think in answering the question, what were we thinking, I haven't arrived at an end. I think this is something that we can continue to do. And so I leave with a kind of open question as to if we start to make these softer virtues, if we start to make, start to tell stories about what it means to face the suffering of the other and respond with courage, where does that take us? What does it lead to? What will our philosophy look like? And I look forward to engaging with the rest of the presentations and the people in this group to make a project that helps us to practice courage. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex. Okay. When you just have a moment, stop sharing your screen and then we can see everybody's lovely faces. Thank
Sure.
you so much.
It's so strange not to present without faces.
Isn't it? It's
Yeah,
a very weird feeling to kind of talk to nobody but know that they're there at the same time. Yeah, I understand. Well, you did a fantastic job. Thank you
thank
so
you very
much.
much.
Well, there's lots in there. So we have 10 minutes for questions, comments, and such. So I'll ask everyone to raise their hand if they'd like to make a contribution. Yeah, I've learned a lot from this talk, and have lots of sort of responses, but I'll keep my comment short and make sure everyone else has time. It seems to me that there were two main themes that were linking up and running through your presentation. One concerned what could ethics look like if it currently is not doing the job that it needs to do. And the other one is I sensed was how do we confront the legacy of empire, the legacy of violence and of moralizing and these kind of things that have sort of shaped our histories and continue to do so, in my opinion. So the only thing I would like to chirp in very quickly, because I get that privilege as host, is in regards to you asked what does ethics look like, and you mentioned a philosophy that could appeal to our senses. And for me, I've drawn a distinction in my own life between moralizing, like a top-down universalistic approach to how things we might feel things ought to be, which has a righteousness attached to it, which is probably the micro-fascism of the legacy of empire that sort of lurks within all of us, at least Foucault, I think, thought so. But that's different from ethics, which for me have lived. Ethics are breathing. Ethics arise from or delivered from earthly contact and relational contact. And so for me, I'm very interested in ethics being bottom up as opposed to the moralizing of top down. And when you say a philosophy that speaks to our senses, that rings true so much with me, because I feel like so much of ethical response is an intuitive response. You talked about senses, and it reminded me of I think it was Rumi who said something along the lines of the soul's been given its own ears to hear what the mind cannot, or what the mind does not understand. So there's like this embodied wisdom that's coming through, and I personally find that that's such an integral element of ethics. Okay, I've given a little bit of time. Let me see if anybody has their hands raised. Any
Well, thanks for that
questions out
rich
there?
comment, Emma, just to say thank you.
Yes. So I don't have any questions at the moment coming up. So in that case, I get to chirp in if I can a little bit. You talk a lot about the difference between facing shame and being shamed. And to me, that's also super important. And I hadn't really thought about that before, but I suppose shaming is the inverse of facing shame. So to shame is to exert some form of control, right? So to shame a collective behavior or an individual's behavior. And really, that's what the penitentiaries were doing. They were shaming the individual and ignoring, I think, structural forces that impose on the individual and why they may act a certain way. Criminalizing the person rather than criminalizing the social system in which they live. But to face shame requires vulnerability and almost a relinquishing of control, like a letting go, because in order to be vulnerable, you have to let go of this idea of hardness, of what strength is. And for me, the lesson of surrendering and letting go and the courage that comes with that is a profound one and a big part of my own journey of trying to grapple with grief and guilt and shame regarding all the stuff in the world that is not loving. you are an experienced practitioner and you work with people a lot. Do you think that in society, there are ways out there that help people deal with their vulnerability and help people face shame and convert it? Or do you think that we're still grappling with this sort of shaming rather than facing shame situation?
Well, so when you mentioned earlier about how people are unlikely to face shame if they have their guard up. You can't be vulnerable if you are fearful
Yeah.
that you're not going to be taken care of. And this is, I think, why it's important to imagine therapy as an ethical practice rather than a medical practice, is because
Yes.
even the language of medicine makes no contact with the kind of ethical issues that we face in our everyday life. And so someone may come and say they have something like depression or they have trauma, because that's the language that they have available, but there may be something else going on. And part of the practice for me is to become very sensitive to what else may be going on. It requires becoming very sensitive to another person's context in which they live. And if you study psychology, which doesn't really pay attention to the context of a person's life, it doesn't really pay attention to their history, in part because these are contextual concerns. And as a body of science is trying to almost cleanse its body of knowledge from contextual concerns. There's been a movement away from that in critical psychology, but I think also given the kind of society in which you grow up, which sort of encourages some of our worst tendencies, to be selfish, to be deceitful, it becomes very hard to trust someone deeply enough to face the things that you are most ashamed of. And if we grow up in a culture which believes in the kind of a punitive way of raising people, then those feelings are going to be so pushed. They're going to push down so deeply that it can take years for them to come up. And so, part of the inspiration that I have, and then in the practice I've inherited, is that it pays very close attention to how long things can take and how long that process can take. But when it happens, it's a profound release. And, it doesn't only just happen in therapy, it happens in art as well. So I think sort of with philosophy, I do think poets are philosophers. I think writers are philosophers. They are worthwhile reading. And they offer us profound insights into what kinds of struggles people are going through, the courage that people have to write about the things that they've gone through. So sorry, your response was so rich, it's hard to know exactly what to respond to. If I've answered your question,
Complicated.
Great. Okay.
No, that was a wonderful response, Alex. Thank you so much. And
there's hope.
I guess the reason part of the reason why I raised that point is because next week I'm hosting a session that's a conversation cafe, which is I've called it The Work That Reconnects. It's based on Joanna Macy's work, but in the context of polycrisis, if you like, in this seminar, it's about a sharing of experiences of both grief and gratitude. And in order to kind of link those two things together. And so I'm hoping that some people will turn up and feel brave enough or safe enough, but it's online space is not the perfect space for sharing. But I hope that people will come and discuss some of their feelings and vulnerabilities, maybe not necessarily deep, dark, shameful sort of elements, but yeah, in that regard. So I think this theme is apt and it's going to continue on. I did see Helen there had her hand up. Helen, would you like to close us out with your comment or question?
Or maybe I could sing a little song or something. Sorry, you were
Yeah.
just finishing up so nicely, and I noticed the
No,
time.
no, I just saw your hand up. We want to hear from you. Absolutely. The talk was dedicated to you. It's very apt.
And I was, oh, Alex, that's so sweet. And I really, really, really love what you've done here. But just a bit, what feels like also needs to be mentioned is humor, because you look at this stuff and it's so astonishing that anybody ever thought this was a good idea. And there's something about seeing just how completely ridiculous it is, and bursting into laughter is a real good way to get out of the trap too.
Can I raise one response to that? So the quote
Please.
that I actually left out was sort of in talking experiences around humor, and that it's quite fear-inspiring to tell the truth because of often the consequences or how your life has to change. That Lingus draws out this really insightful reading of Aristotle, which is that without courage, well, it's Aristotle says that courage is the first virtue. It's not a list on top of a list of virtues, but it's the transcendent virtue because it makes many other important virtues possible. And the way that makes them possible is that without courage, there's no truth. Without courage, there's no love. Because we are never more profoundly vulnerable than we are when we are in love. And so truth becomes a part of the game, that it's love. And if I look at society sort of very cruel, I think that becomes a very important question, because what is lost when you feel prideful about your history is that you lose a profound chance to love.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, on that profound last sentence, I think that might be a time to end the seminar. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Alex. Absolutely loved hearing from you, and thanks everyone for your attention, and I hope to see you all again next week. And for now, I will say goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Helen.
Cheers. Till next
Bye.
time. Bye bye.